All right, let's jump right in today. We're going to take a deep dive into India's economic roller coaster.
Yeah.
We're talking about those billionaires, the oligarchs, they're calling them, right?
Yeah.
And looking at kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of this huge economic boom. You sent over the Billionaire Raj, and then some really interesting analysis in another language, which I'll be honest, I couldn't quite decipher.
hmm
But let's try to untangle this whole thing together, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing to see how India went from like those, socialist style policies they've had for so long in the last century to really embracing globalization in the 90s. I mean,
Yeah.
especially between 2004 and 2014, the growth was like incredible.
Yeah, like over 8% a year, right? That's huge. But the Billionaire Raj kind of makes it clear that not everyone was, riding that wave equally.
No, no, for sure. I mean, you saw this surge in billionaires, right?
Yeah.
From like just 2 in the 90s to a whopping 49 by 2010. But at the same time, inequality also just exploded. By 2013, you had the top 1% holding like 58% of the entire country's wealth.
Whoa, that is a pretty big gap. So how do we make sense of that? Is that just like growing pains, or is there something more messed up going on?
Yeah, to really get it, I think we got to go beyond the numbers, right? We need to look at the stories of the people who were kind of at the heart of this era. And Mukesh Ambani is a good place to start, I think. His story really kind of mirrors India's whole economic journey.
Yeah, Ambani's a name that even if you're not like a business nerd, you probably recognize.
Yeah.
But just to set the scene for our listener, the Billionaire Raj describes this incident in Mumbai where like this Aston Martin just crashes in the middle of the night. The driver just vanishes, like poof, gone before the cops even get there. Turns out, whose car was it?
Mukesh Ambani's top of the line model too, worth like millions.
Millions, yeah.
And it happened right near his house, his rather large house.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? This whole incident happening right in the shadow of Antilia, his skyscraper home. I mean, it captured everyone's attention.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how can you ignore a 27-story billion-dollar home in a city where, let's be honest, poverty is still a pretty big issue, right?
Yeah, it kind of brings that 58% wealth concentration we were talking about into focus, doesn't it?
Yeah, into a real tangible form.
Right, absolutely. Antilia, I mean, it's got helipads, ballrooms, even a snow room. It's like a symbol of that extreme wealth next to, such widespread poverty. But we got to look beyond just the spectacle, right? What's behind this wealth? Ambani, he's the head of Reliance Industries. It's massive. They're into oil, gas, textiles, retail, and now telecom too.
Right, and that's where Geo comes in, right? That telecom venture, they just like disrupted everything, super chip data plans, and boom, they basically dominated the market.
Yeah. Geo, they really shook things up. I mean, there were concerns about, fair competition, accusations of them using predatory pricing, using their money from other businesses to basically just crush their rivals.
Right.
And it kind of brings us back to that question, right? Crony capitalism. Does a system that favors the wealthy, does it ultimately hurt real competition?
Right. So we got Ambani as like this symbol of success, but also potentially, the dark side of the boon. Now, the Billionaire Raj also talks about Vijay Mallya, went from king of good times to like facing exile, a ton of debt.
Yeah.
This guy owned Kingfisher Beer, an airline, even a cricket team.
Mm-hmm.
What does his fall from grace tell us about this whole era?
Well, I think it shows that even in this boom, not everyone was invincible. I mean, a lot of these tycoons got kind of carried away, easy credit, maybe a bit too much confidence, and they overextended themselves.
Right.
Mallya, his defense was basically, he wasn't the only one playing the game, right? He said he wasn't the only one taking advantage of the system. Maybe others just got luckier.
Makes you wonder if that's like the exception or the rule, right?
Right.
And speaking of rules, maybe bending them a little, let's talk about Gautam Adani. His rise was, well, less flashy than Mallya's, but just as interesting.
Yeah, he's known for these huge infrastructure projects, the Mundra port, for example, and the land for that port leased from the government. And a lot of people thought the terms were, well, very favorable to him.
So that land acquisition process sounds like a breeding ground for cronyism, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, Adani, he always said he earned his success through hard work and, good business sense. But his ties to politicians, especially Narendra Modi, who later became prime minister, those ties raised some eyebrows.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern, right? Entrepreneurial drives mixed with political connections. And it leads us to a big question. How did this system that kind of let crony capitalism thrive, how did it come about?
Well, to get that, we got to rewind a bit. India, they had this thing called the license Raj. Basically, it was this bureaucratic nightmare. Permits, regulations, it was stifling businesses. Officially, they got rid of it in the 90s, but the legacy kind of lingered. Access to government favors became the new way to get ahead, the new currency.
So instead of cutting through red tape, you had to play a different game.
Yeah.
A game of connections and favors.
Exactly. And that's where rent-seeking comes in. It's not about creating something valuable. It's about manipulating the system, exploiting loopholes, using connections to get ahead. You want to see this in action. Look at the 2008 telecom scandal. You had companies mysteriously showing up with all the right paperwork, ready to go on the very day licenses were handed out. First come, first served, they said.
That's wild. It sounds like it was all planned in advance, right? I mean, like
Right.
coordinated. So if these companies weren't competing on merit, who was like pulling the strings?
The Billionaire Raj talks about the middlemen, people who acted as like intermediaries, facilitating bribes, influencing decision makers, making sure everyone got their cut. And it wasn't just at the top, it trickled down. Even everyday stuff was affected. There's a story in the book about how back then you even needed a middleman to buy a TV or a fridge.
Wow, even for like everyday purchases.
Yeah.
That shows you how deep this culture of connections went.
Deep, yeah. And remember, we're focused on the billionaires here, right? But this system, it affected ordinary people, too, in a big way.
Right.
While these oligarchs were building their empires, inequality in India was skyrocketing.
All right, that 1% holding 58% of the wealth. But what was it like for the other 99% during this boom?
Well, the truth is the benefits weren't shared equally, not even close. The Billionaire Raj points out that even with a growing economy, India had a surprisingly low number of income taxpayers. It shows this massive informal economy, millions of people working with no security, no benefits. It was
Right.
like two different worlds existing side by side.
And that brings to mind that example, the Anawadi slum, right? Right near the Mumbai airport. It's like this clash between the aspirations of a modernizing India and the reality of poverty.
Yeah, it's powerful. Anawadi, you've got these people living in fear of demolition, literally in the shadow of this shiny new symbol of progress. It shows you that economic growth doesn't automatically equal a fair and just society.
So we've got this backdrop, right? We got billionaires on the rise, crony capitalism, huge inequalities. How does it all connect to politics? I mean, what's the link between these tycoons and the way power works in India?
Oh, it's a huge link. Elections in India, they're expensive. Politicians, they need a lot of money to run their campaigns, and they rely heavily on these wealthy donors, right? So it creates this kind of cycle of favors and obligations. It gets kind of blurry, the line between business and politics.
So are you saying these billionaires are basically buying influence?
I mean, it's not always that direct, that transactional. But the Billionaire Raj, it talks about this idea of money power. Basically, wealth gives you a lot of sway over the whole election process. They even talk about this case with Mayawati. She's a big-time politician, and she was accused of literally selling party tickets to the highest bidders.
Wow, that's taking it to a whole other level. It makes you wonder if this is happening at the national level, what's going on in the individual states, right? The Billionaire Raj focuses on Uttar Pradesh. They call it UP. Why is that state so important in this whole story?
Well, UP, it's symbolic, right? It's India's most populous state, and it's always been a big player in national politics. They call it the political heartland of India. But economically, it's still pretty backward.
So you got all this power concentrated in a state that hasn't really benefited from the boom.
Exactly. And that makes UP a perfect example of how crony capitalism can actually hold back development. The book argues that the money power system thrives in those kinds of places. It creates this vicious cycle where politicians are more interested in enriching themselves and their buddies than, actually investing in public services and infrastructure.
It's a reminder that, economic growth without good governance can actually make the gap between the rich and the poor even worse. Now, in the middle of all this, you had Narendra Modi coming in, promising change, a break from the past.
Right.
He campaigned on this anti-corruption platform, saying he was going to clean up the system. Did he deliver?
Well, Modi's rise, it's a whole other chapter, right? He did implement some reforms, making India to boost manufacturing. He tried to simplify the bureaucracy. But his close ties to guys like Adani, they raised questions about whether he was really breaking from that cronyism.
Yeah, the book even mentions how Adani's company, its share prices, they surged before the election. It's like the markets knew that his connection to Modi was going to be good for business.
It certainly fueled that perception. And then there's that demonetization policy in 2016. I mean, Modi literally just like invalidated certain currency notes overnight. He said it was to fight black money.
I remember that. It was huge news. People were scrambling to exchange their old notes. Lines at banks were crazy. So what was the impact? Did it work?
Well, people are still debating that. It definitely disrupted the informal economy, brought some black money into the system.
Okay.
But it also caused a lot of hardship for ordinary folks, especially those who relied on cash.
So a bit of a mixed bag then. Speaking of mixed bags, what about the media? India's got this, like, really vibrant media landscape, right?
Yeah.
Tons of debates, investigative journalism. What role did they play in all this? The boom, the inequality, the cronyism, all of it.
Oh, the media, they were crucial in exposing corruption, holding the powerful accountable. The book talks about guys like Arnab Goswami. He's got these like fiery TV debates that everyone watches. But it also acknowledges that the media, it can be sensationalist, ratings driven, sometimes amplifying the very problems they're trying to expose.
Yeah, that's the media, right?
Yeah.
Watchdog, but sometimes part of the problem too. It seems like a recurring theme here in our deep dive. Progress mixed with setbacks, opportunities, but also challenges.
Yeah.
This economic boom, it wasn't just about GDP numbers, right?
No.
It was about real people dealing with the consequences of all this change.
Exactly. We've been focused on the big players here, the tycoons, the politicians, but we got to remember the human cost too. The book uses that example of the Anawadi slum right there by Mumbai's fancy new airport. It's like this stark reminder.
Yeah, you got the residents of Anawadi living in poverty, constantly worried about being demolished, while just a stone's throw away, the elite are living it up in luxury. It's hard to fathom that gap.
Anawadi, it's like a microcosm of this bigger issue of inequality. It shows that even with impressive economic growth, millions get left behind, still struggling with poverty, lack of basic services.
It highlights the need to look beyond just the shiny facade of progress and see how it's affecting those who aren't part of this billionaire Raj.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
No.
India's got this incredible entrepreneurial spirit. That's going to be a big part of this economic growth story.
Oh, absolutely. The energy, the innovation of Indian entrepreneurs, it's remarkable. So many people starting businesses, creating jobs. And it's not just the big guys, it's the small and medium-sized businesses, too. They're a huge part of it.
That's what makes India's story so interesting, right? That
Yeah.
spirit. But the question is, can that spirit really thrive in a system that a lot of times seems to favor those with connections?
That's the challenge, creating a space where entrepreneurship can flourish without being held back by cronyism.
No.
And the billionaire Raj argues that we got to tackle the structural issues, right? The things that create an uneven playing field.
So, leveling the playing field. How do we do that?
Well, streamlining regulations, tackling corruption, improving infrastructure, that's all crucial. The book also talks about access to finance for small businesses, right?
Yeah.
Empowering them to compete.
It's about creating that environment where people are encouraged to start businesses, not held back by the system.
Right.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the financial sector. It's got to be a big part of any economy, especially a developing one like India,
Right.
where access to capital is often, limited.
Mm.
How did India's financial sector play into all this? The boom, the bust, all of it.
Well, India's financial sector, it went through a big transformation, right? They liberalized banking, the stock market grew. It led to more access to capital, which definitely fueled the boom. But the billionaire Raj, it also exposes this dark side, the house of debt, they call it. Basically, all these bad loans that piled up in the banking system.
So the financial boom, which was supposed to be a good thing, also created some serious risks.
Exactly. The growth, it wasn't always managed well. The book talks about lax lending standards, banks just throwing money at projects, even risky ones, just to, cash in on the boom. But there's a deeper problem, too. The influence of crony capitalism on lending practices.
So those connections, again, are we saying that banks were pressured to lend to companies that were politically connected, even if those companies weren't, good borrowers?
Yeah, the book suggests that happened a lot. And when those companies defaulted, it had this domino effect. It weakened the whole financial system, ultimately hurting economic growth. Crony capitalism leading to bad loans, which then undermine the economy even further. It's this vicious cycle.
So it's not just about writing off those bad loans, right?
No.
What can be done to fix the financial sector?
Well, the billionaire Raj talks about strengthening bank regulations, improving corporate governance, and really getting to the root of the problem, that crony capitalism. It's about building a system that prioritizes sound financial practices over political favors.
It's a reminder that a healthy financial sector is vital for a healthy economy, but also for social and political stability. When people lose faith in the system, things can get really messy. So it's not just about numbers, it's about trust.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about crony capitalism, inequality, the financial sector. What about politics itself?
Right.
How does all of this fit into India's political landscape?
Well, politics, it's at the heart of any democracy, right? And India, with its huge population, so many different political parties, it's got this really vibrant, really complex political landscape.
Yeah, it's not like a simple two-party system like you see in some countries. Does that complexity make it harder to govern effectively?
It definitely creates some unique challenges, but the Billionaire Raj, it argues that while India's multi-party system can make it tough to form stable governments and put policies in place, that democracy is also a strength.
So another one of those double-edged swords.
Exactly. It's important to see both the good and the bad, right?
The book digs into some specific things about Indian politics that are really relevant to our discussion here. One of them is that idea of money power, which we talked about earlier.
Right. How wealth equals political influence. Is there, like, actual evidence to support that? Or is it just a cynical view of things?
The Billionaire Raj doesn't shy away from showing the evidence. It details how elections are really expensive in India, so politicians depend on wealthy donors to fund their campaigns. And that creates this situation where donors might expect favors in return. It can compromise the whole political process.
So it's not just about individuals with bad intentions, it's about a system that allows this to happen.
Yeah, that's it. And while there have been attempts to reform campaign financing to make things more transparent, it's still a big issue.
Money in politics, even in a democracy, it can really distort things. What else does the book highlight about Indian politics?
Well, it looks at identity politics, how social divisions like caste, religion, language, they all factor into the political scene. So are we talking about voting blocks based on these identities?
It's not always that simple. While identity can influence how people vote, the Billionaire Raj makes it clear that there are tons of other factors too, right? Economic interests, local issues, how competent people think the candidates are.
It's a reminder that people are complex. You can't just put them in a box.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of complex, what about political parties? How does the book portray them?
Well, the Billionaire Raj, it focuses mainly on the two big national parties, the Congress Party and the BJP, but it also acknowledges how important the regional parties are. And it talks about how this multi-party system, while it allows for different voices and perspectives, can also make it tough to form stable governments and put long-term policies in place.
Another double-edged sword.
You got it. So it seems like India's political landscape is all about, like, balance, right? Balancing different forces, different interests. But to bring it back to our main topic, how does all this political complexity affect crony capitalism and inequality? The Billionaire Raj argues that crony capitalism, it thrives in places where power is concentrated, where things aren't transparent, where there's not a lot of accountability. It suggests that India's political system, with all its tangled relationships and backroom deals, it can create the perfect environment for cronyism to take root.
So it's not just a few bad apples, it's the whole barrel that's kind of rotten.
That's a key takeaway, yeah. It's not just an India problem either. Crony capitalism, it's everywhere. It pops up wherever you've got weak governance and a lack of rule of law.
So what's the solution? Can you even fight this effectively, or are we just stuck in this cycle?
The Billionaire Raj says we need a multi-pronged approach. Stronger institutions, more transparency, empowered citizens. It's a long, tough process, but the book says it's essential if we want a more just and equitable system.
It's a reminder that we got to acknowledge the problems, but not get so bogged down in the negative that we miss the good stuff too. India's made incredible strides. Millions of people lifted out of poverty. The country's become a real force in the global economy.
For sure. India's economic transformation has been amazing. You got a booming tech sector, a growing middle class. They're investing in infrastructure. It's impressive.
But can it last? Can India keep this up? Or will these challenges we've been talking about bring it all down?
That's the big question. And the Billionaire Raj, it says it depends on a few things, like good governance, investing in education and people, and crucially, building a more inclusive and equitable society.
So it's not just about growing the economy, it's about making sure everyone benefits, that the system works for everyone, not just a select few.
That's it. India, it needs to build a society where everyone has the chance to succeed, no matter their background, no matter their connections. And that means tackling those deep-rooted issues that keep inequality and cronyism alive. It's a tough task, but the Billionaire Raj leaves us with a little bit of hope, right? India, with all its history, its culture, its entrepreneurial spirit, it can overcome these obstacles.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to our listener. What are the key takeaways here? What should they be thinking about?
I think the big thing for our listener to understand is that this isn't just some abstract discussion, right?
Right.
This is about real people, real lives impacted by all this.
Yeah, the Billionaire Raj, it really encourages us to look beyond the statistics, the GDP numbers, and see the human stories.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that progress, it's rarely a straight line.
Right.
Right? It's messy, it's complicated.
And it's a journey we're all on, in a way.
Yeah.
The book shows how interconnected our world has become. Decisions made in one place can affect people everywhere.
So even though we're talking about India, there are lessons here for everyone, everywhere. We're all stakeholders in this global story of economic growth, inequality, and the search for a better world. Absolutely. And one of the biggest takeaways from the Billionaire Raj is that we all have a part to play in writing the next chapter. Our choices as consumers, how we engage politically, the organizations we support, it all matters.
Even small actions can make a difference. So let's dig into one specific aspect of India's new Gilded Age, something that our listener might connect with: the human cost of this boom.
While the headlines are all about GDP growth and corporate profits, the Billionaire Raj forces us to look at what's happened to those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
It reminds us that progress often comes at a price, and that price is usually paid by those who are already struggling.
We talked about the gap between the rich and the poor, the millions who are still trying to make ends meet, even with all this growth. The Billionaire Raj uses the example of Anawadi slum to really drive this point home.
Anawadi, with its residents living in poverty, facing eviction, it's a powerful symbol.
Yeah.
It shows the stark contrast between those who are winning in India's economy and those who are getting left behind.
It's a reminder that development isn't just about building fancy airports and skyscrapers. It's about making sure everyone has the opportunity to share in the prosperity.
Right, and that means addressing not just economic inequality, but the things that cause it in the first place. The Billionaire Raj looks at how access to education, healthcare, even basic necessities can be so different depending on your background.
So even if everyone suddenly had more money, there would still be these underlying problems. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot.
Exactly. And that needs a multi-pronged approach. Government policies, private sector initiatives, and the work of civil society groups, social entrepreneurs, all of it.
So it's a team effort, not just the government, not just the market, but everyone working together.
That's what the Billionaire Raj emphasizes, yeah.
Mhm.
If we want a more equitable society, it's got to be a collaborative effort.
Now, we've been focusing on the challenges, but it's also important to celebrate the good stuff. The resilience, the entrepreneurial spirit, those are hallmarks of India, right? How does the Billionaire Raj capture that?
It's full of stories about people who overcame huge obstacles to build successful businesses. They contributed to the growth of the country. And it's not just the famous ones, it's the countless small businesses that really make the Indian economy tick.
That's inspiring. Even when things are tough, people find a way to create opportunities. But going back to crony capitalism, can that entrepreneurial spirit really thrive if the system favors the connected?
That's the question. How do we create an environment where entrepreneurship can flourish without being held back by cronyism? The Billionaire Raj argues that it's about addressing those structural issues, creating a level playing field.
So rewarding merit and hard work instead of connections. What are some of the recommendations for making that happen?
The book talks about continuing to simplify regulations, reducing corruption, improving infrastructure. It also highlights access to finance for small businesses, giving them the resources to compete.
Building a better environment for businesses, encouraging innovation, rewarding hard work. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the financial sector. The Billionaire Raj explores how it played a role in fueling growth, but also created some big problems.
Yeah. India's banking industry was liberalized, the stock market grew, people had more access to capital, which was good for businesses. But the Billionaire Raj talks about this house of debt problem, all those bad loans in the banks.
So the financial boom had a downside too. What caused all those bad loans? Were the banks just too reckless?
The book says there were a few things, like loose lending standards, a lot of risk-taking during the boom, but it goes deeper. saying that crony capitalism played a big part.
Those connections again. Are you saying that banks were pressured to lend money to politically connected companies, even if those companies were risky?
The billionaire Raj suggests that was definitely happening, and when those companies couldn't pay back their loans, it had this ripple effect, right? Weak banks, slower economic growth. It's like crony capitalism feeding the problem, making things worse.
It's like a self-inflicted wound. So what's the fix? Is it just about getting rid of those bad loans?
It's more complicated than that. The billionaire Raj says we need to tighten banking regulations, improve how companies are governed, and really deal with crony capitalism. It's about building a financial system that values good practices over political connections.
Right. And a healthy financial system is about more than just numbers. It's about trust.
Yeah.
People need to have faith in the system. Now let's talk politics. The billionaire Raj digs into how Indian politics play into all of this.
Politics are at the heart of it all, right? The book looks at India's multi-party system, the good and the bad.
Yeah, we talked about the Congress Party, the BJP, all those regional parties, the whole mix. What does the billionaire Raj say about how this political system affects crony capitalism and inequality?
Well, it argues that crony capitalism does really well in places where power is concentrated, where there's not much transparency or accountability. It suggests that India's political system, with all its connections and backroom deals, can be a breeding ground for cronyism.
So it's not just a few bad guys, it's the whole system.
That's the point, yeah. And the billionaire Raj also acknowledges the good parts of India's democracy.
Right, how the multi-party system, while it can be messy, also allows for different voices and keeps people accountable.
Exactly. It's about seeing both sides and working to make democratic institutions stronger, more resistant to corruption and influence.
So it's a balancing act, recognizing the problems of crony capitalism and inequality, but also seeing the progress India's made.
For sure. The billionaire Raj reminds us that this is a story that's still being written. The decisions India makes will shape its future, but they'll also have an impact on the whole world.
So even if you don't live in India, this story matters.
Absolutely. And the billionaire Raj encourages us to go beyond just observing, to think about how we can make the world a more just and equitable place. What we buy, how we vote, the groups we support, it all adds up.
It's about taking action, even small steps. So let's focus on one specific aspect of India's new Gilded Age, something our listener can really connect with. The human cost of all this.
The billionaire Raj pushes us to look beyond the shiny headlines and see the impact on those who are most vulnerable. It's a reminder that progress often comes at a price, and that price is usually paid by those who are already struggling.
Right. We've been talking about the gap between the rich and the poor, the millions who are still trying to make ends meet. The billionaire Raj uses the example of Anawadi slum to really drive that point home. It's a stark contrast.
Anawadi, with its residents living in poverty, facing eviction, it's a powerful symbol. It shows the stark contrast between those who are winning in India's economy and those who are getting left behind.
It's a reminder that development isn't just about building fancy airports and skyscrapers.
Right.
It's about making sure everyone has the opportunity to share in the prosperity.
Exactly. And that means addressing not just economic inequality, but the things that cause it in the first place. The billionaire Raj looks at how access to education, healthcare, even basic necessities can be so different depending on your background.
So even if everyone suddenly had more money, there would still be these underlying problems. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot.
That's it. And that needs a multi-pronged approach. Government policies, private sector initiatives, and the work of civil society groups, social entrepreneurs, all of it.
So it's a team effort, not just the government, not just the market, but everyone working together.
That's what the billionaire Raj emphasizes.
Yeah.
If we want a more equitable society, it's got to be a collaborative effort.
Now, we've been focusing on the challenges, but it's also important to celebrate the good stuff, right?
Yeah.
The resilience, the entrepreneurial spirit, those are hallmarks of India. How does the billionaire Raj capture that?
It's full of stories about people who overcame huge obstacles to build successful businesses, contributed into India's growth. And it's not just the famous ones, it's the countless small businesses that really make the Indian economy tick.
That's inspiring. Even when things are tough, people find a way to create opportunities. But going back to crony capitalism, can that entrepreneurial spirit really thrive if the system favors the connected?
That's the question. How do we create an environment where entrepreneurship can flourish without being held back by cronyism? The billionaire Raj argues that we got to address those structural issues that create an uneven playing field.
Level the playing field. So rewarding merit and hard work instead of connections. What are some of the book's recommendations for making that happen?
The Billionaire Raj talks about continuing to simplify regulations, reducing corruption, improving infrastructure. It also highlights access to finance for small businesses, giving them the resources to compete.
Building a better environment for businesses, encouraging innovation, rewarding hard work. Now let's shift gears and talk about the financial sector. The Billionaire Raj explores how it played a role in fueling growth, but also created some big problems.
India's banking industry was liberalized, the stock market grew, people had more access to capital, which was good for businesses. But the Billionaire Raj also talks about this house of debt problem, all those bad loans in the banks.
The financial boom had a downside. What caused all those bad loans? Were banks just being reckless?
It says there were a few things at play. Loose lending standards, a lot of risk-taking during the boom. But it also points to crony capitalism as a major factor.
So those connections again, are you saying banks were pressured to lend to companies with political ties, even if those companies were risky borrowers?
The Billionaire Raj suggests that was going on, and when those companies couldn't repay, it had a ripple effect, weakening banks, slowing growth, crony capitalism, basically making the problem worse.
A self-inflicted wound. So how do you fix it? Is it just about getting rid of those bad loans?
It's more complicated than that. The Billionaire Raj recommends tightening bank regulations, improving corporate governance, and addressing the root cause, crony capitalism. Building a financial system that values good practices, not political favors.
Right. It's about trust in the system. People need to believe in it. Now, let's talk politics. How does all this fit into India's political landscape?
Politics are crucial, right? The book takes a look at India's multi-party system, the good and the bad.
We talked about the Congress Party, the BJP, and all the regional parties. How does the Billionaire Raj say this political setup affects crony capitalism and inequality?
It argues that crony capitalism does well in places where power is concentrated, where there's a lack of transparency and accountability. It suggests that India's political system, with its web of relationships and behind-the-scenes deals, can create a perfect environment for cronyism.
So it's not just a few bad apples, it's the system.
Yeah. The Billionaire Raj also recognizes the positive aspects of India's democracy.
Right. The multi-party system, while it can be chaotic, also allows for diverse voices and helps keep people accountable.
Exactly. It's about seeing both sides and trying to make those democratic institutions stronger.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Recognizing the problems of crony capitalism and inequality, while also seeing the progress that India has made.
The Billionaire Raj reminds us that this is an ongoing story, a story that's still being written. And the choices India makes in the coming years, they'll shape its own future, but they'll also have an impact on the whole world.
This is a global story, not just an Indian one.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to go beyond just watching and think about how we can help make the world a better place. The things we buy, our political choices, the groups we support, it all makes a difference.
It's about taking action. So let's dig into one specific part of this new Gilded Age in India, the human cost of this boom, something I think our listener can connect with.
While the headlines are all about GDP and corporate profits, the Billionaire Raj makes us look at how all this is affecting the most vulnerable people.
Right. Progress comes at a price.
Yeah.
And often, those who are already struggling are the ones paying it.
We've talked about the gap between the rich and the poor. The Billionaire Raj uses the Anawadi slum as an example to really show this contrast.
Anawadi, you've got people living in poverty, facing eviction, right next to these symbols of wealth and progress. It's powerful.
It's a reminder that development isn't just about building shiny new things, it's about making sure everyone benefits.
Absolutely. And that means addressing not just the inequality itself, but the root causes. The Billionaire Raj looks at how things like education, healthcare, even basic necessities are so unequally distributed.
Even if everyone had more money, these problems would still be there.
Right. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair chance, regardless of their circumstances.
A level playing field.
Exactly. And for that, you need a multi-pronged approach. The government, the private sector, civil society groups, social entrepreneurs, everyone needs to work together.
It's a team effort.
That's what the Billionaire Raj emphasizes. Yeah. So it's not just about the government or the market fixing things. It's about everyone working together for a more equitable society.
Exactly.
Now, we've been focused on the challenges, but India's also got this incredible resilience and entrepreneurial spirit. How does the book capture that?
The book is full of stories about people who overcame huge obstacles to build successful businesses. They contributed to India's growth. And it's not just the big names, it's those countless small businesses that are really the backbone of the Indian economy.
People finding ways to create opportunities even when things are tough. But going back to crony capitalism, can that entrepreneurial spirit really thrive if the system favors the connected?
That's the big question. How do you create an environment where anyone can succeed, not just those with connections? The billionaire Raj argues that we need to address the structural issues, the things that create an uneven playing field.
Level the playing field.
Yeah.
What are some of the recommendations the book gives for doing that?
They talk about continuing to simplify regulations, reducing corruption, improving infrastructure, and it also stresses the importance of access to finance for small businesses, giving them the tools to compete.
So creating a better business environment, encouraging innovation, rewarding hard work. Let's shift gears and talk about the financial sector. The billionaire Raj explores how it helped fuel growth, but also created some pretty big problems along the way.
Yeah. India opened up its banking industry, the stock market grew, people had more access to capital, and that was good for businesses. But the book also talks about this house of debt problem, all those bad loans in the banking system.
So this financial boom had a dark side. What happened? Why were there so many bad loans?
The book points to a few factors, like lending standards weren't very strict, there was a lot of risk-taking going on during the boom, but it also suggests that crony capitalism played a big part.
Ah, those connections again. So are you saying banks were pressured to give loans to companies that had political connections, even if those companies were, not the best borrowers?
The billionaire Raj suggests that was a common practice. And when those companies defaulted, it created this ripple effect. Banks were weakened and economic growth was hurt. It's like crony capitalism was making the problem even worse.
So it wasn't just about bad business decisions. It was about politics influencing those decisions. How do you fix that? Is it just about getting rid of those bad loans?
The book suggests a more comprehensive approach. It talks about tightening those banking regulations, improving how companies are governed, and really tackling the root of the problem, that crony capitalism, creating a system that prioritizes good financial practices over political favors.
It's about building a financial system that people can trust.
Right.
One that's built on sound principles, not backroom deals.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about politics. How does all of this play into India's political landscape?
Well, the billionaire Raj takes a close look at India's political system, especially its multi-party system. It highlights both the strengths and the weaknesses.
We talked about the two main national parties, the Congress Party and the BJP and all those regional parties. It's a pretty complex setup. What does the book say about how all this affects crony capitalism and inequality?
It argues that crony capitalism tends to flourish in systems where power is concentrated, where there's not a lot of transparency, not much accountability. It suggests that India's political system, with all its connections and backroom deals, can be a breeding ground for cronyism.
So it's not just about a few bad actors. It's about the system itself being vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
That's right. But the billionaire Raj also points out the positives of India's democracy.
Yeah, like we talked about before, the multi-party system, even though it can be messy, it does give a voice to different groups and provides ways to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's about recognizing both sides and working to make those democratic institutions stronger, less susceptible to corruption and undue influence.
It's about finding that balance, recognizing the challenges of crony capitalism and inequality, while also acknowledging the progress that India has made.
Absolutely. And the billionaire Raj reminds us that this is a story that's still unfolding. What happens next in India will shape its own future, but it will also impact the world.
So this story matters to all of us, even if we don't live in India.
Exactly. The book encourages us to go beyond simply observing and think about how we can all contribute to a more just and equitable world. Our consumer choices, our political actions, the organizations we support, it all matters.
It's about taking action, even if it seems small. So let's zoom in on one specific aspect of India's new Gilded Age that might resonate with our listener: the human cost of this economic boom.
The billionaire Raj really pushes us to look beyond those shiny headlines about economic growth and see what's happening to those who are most vulnerable. Progress often comes with a price tag, and often it's those who are already struggling who end up paying it.
Right. And we've talked about this gap between the rich and the poor in India. The book uses the example of Anawadi's slum to really illustrate this divide. You've got people living in poverty, facing eviction, right next to these symbols of wealth and progress. It's a striking image.
Yeah, it really drives home the point that development isn't just about building impressive things. It's about ensuring everyone benefits.
Exactly. It's about making sure that prosperity is shared. So how do we make that happen? How do we bridge that gap?
The Billionaire Raj highlights the need to address not just economic inequality, but also those underlying systemic issues that create and perpetuate it. It talks about unequal access to education, healthcare, even basic necessities like clean water and sanitation. These are things that need to be
But
addressed.
it's not just about giving people more money. It's about creating a system where everyone has a genuine opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Exactly. It requires a multi-pronged approach. It's about the government implementing the right policies, the private sector stepping up and doing its part, and civil society, those NGOs and social entrepreneurs working on the ground to make a difference.
So it's a collective effort. We all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
The billionaire Raj really drives home the point that creating a more equitable society requires everyone to work together.
Right. It's not just about pointing fingers, it's about rolling up our sleeves and doing the work.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into The Billionaire Raj. It's a book that challenges us to think critically, to engage with complex issues, and to consider the role we can all play in creating a more just and equitable world.
It's a reminder that the story of India, the story of globalization, the story of inequality, it's a story that's still being written. And we all have a part in shaping how that story unfolds.
So we encourage our listeners to keep exploring, to keep learning, and to keep asking those tough questions. Because ultimately, creating a better world starts with each of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.